To quote Thomas Jefferson, a well-informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. Welcome to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God, where we discuss the basics of our constitutional republic and how our freedoms are being seized by public officials, both elected and unelected. I'm Mark DeLuzio, a former candidate for the U.S. Congress and a Gold Star father. Join me as we learn together how we can save this unique experiment that we call America. Hi, I'm Mark DeLuzio for the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God. This is episode 44. We're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution, its history, why it's still important, and also it's tied back to something we talked about in episode 43, which is the Declaration of Independence. These two documents are linked. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't listened to that episode, you listen to that as well as this one, so you can get the full picture as to how all of this kind of came to be, and why it's important to understand both when you're having discussions with your friends and family about our founding documents. A little knowledge sometimes is a good thing. I was going to say a dangerous thing, but the right knowledge is a very good thing. And so hopefully you'll appreciate both of these episodes. So episode 44, and let's get into the Constitution. Okay. A lot of questions about the Constitution and its founding, but I thought I'd take you through a little bit of the history and how it's constructed and what it all means. We go into more detail about this in previous episodes, especially early on in this podcast history. We talk about each of the articles and the Bill of Rights and everything else. And there's so much more to talk about. The funny thing about the Constitution is I think I know it pretty well, but once I get into it and start digging in, I open up more doors about the brilliance of this Constitution and the founders that put it together. So it's absolutely incredible as to the forethought these guys had, and how unique and special our form of government, which I think is taken for granted by a lot of Americans today. And all you need to do is travel to another country that doesn't speak our language totally and go out into the outskirts, stay away from the big cities like Shanghai. Okay, you'll see what I mean as to how lucky we are as a country. So let's get into it. So, what is the Constitution? Well, first of all, it was written by James Madison. Okay. And Madison was, I think, in his late 20s when he wrote it. It's our framework for our system of government. Okay. And again, other people weighed in on it, not just James Madison, but he was the primary author. The original Constitution, before we got to the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments, we'll talk about that, was only 4,543 words. Okay. And what a lot of people seem to forget today is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In the Constitution, there are a bunch of clauses that you're going to hear people talk about. Well, this is the supremacy clause. That means the state cannot override a federal law as long as it's pursuant thereof, pursuant to legalities to the Constitution. If it's an unconstitutional law, then no, okay? But a state can't supersede, ignore, or violate a federal law provided it is pursuant thereof to the Constitution. Okay. The Constitution divides the power between the federal government and the states. And this was a bone of contention with a lot of the founders. They didn't all sing off the same hem sheet. Adams and Hamilton, for example, wanted bigger government and more control. And people like Jefferson and Madison wanted smaller, limited government, which was a real sticking point in terms of getting the 13 colonies to sign on to this, okay, especially in New York. We'll talk about the Federalist Papers a little bit later, all right? It's the oldest written national constitution today in use. it talks about the components of the federal government, which I'll talk about in a minute. It was written in 1887, ratified in 1787, ratified in 1788, and it's been in operation since 1789. Now, our website for this constitution is called 1787solution.com. Okay. We happen to pick that year amongst the others because that's when it was written, and that's where we think this whole thing got launched, if you will. Okay. Now, why do we have a constitution? The Constitution protects the rights of U.S. citizens from being infringed by the federal government. And if you go back to episode 43 and look at the Declaration of Independence episode, you'll see there were 27 grievances that the colonies had with the King of England. 27 grievances, of which found their way into the Constitution as either enumerated rights or unalienable rights. Okay. But the whole idea of the federal government is to protect our rights as citizens and invest the power of the union in the people, not the government, in the people. And it outlines many of these freedoms of the people. Okay. It's really important to understand that rights are not granted by the federal or state government for that matter. Okay. Kamala Harris, when she ran for president, said that Elon Musk, his right to free speech is a privilege, denoting the fact that it was the government that gave him that right for free speech. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's the government's job to protect our freedom of speech and other rights as well, which, of course, our government did a terrible job at over the last few years. And you remember the Twitter controversy and how the government basically suppressed conservative views on social media. That is a First Amendment violation, by the way. Okay. When the government gets that. If Twitter wants to not print something that you say, that's up to them. That's not the government. Remember, the First Amendment has to do with the government's uh, inability to be able to, to infringe your right to free speech. Not a newspaper, not Facebook. They can post whatever, they can allow whatever they want on their mediums as long as it's not being directed by the government. Okay, so rights are not granted by the government. It's a really important thing to remember as we go through on this episode. Okay, why was it written? The very first Constitution that we have, called the Articles of Confederation, had no teeth and it was weak. It was ineffective and it gave too much power to the states. So much so that states were taxing other states, they were creating terrorists between state boundaries. The country just couldn't operate, and it didn't really address the national issues that we needed to deal with. So you're going to see in the Constitution we have a Commerce Clause. We prohibit states from, setting terrorists with other states. We needed to get the country to work, and the Articles of Confederation was so loosely written that there was no teeth in it. All right. So the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, where all of this was developed, aimed to create a federal government with enough power to act on a national level, but without too much power that our rights being the states and the people, would not be infringed. Okay. And if you look at the preamble, it makes it clear why the Constitution was written. And I'm just going to read it to you. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, by the way, they knew we weren't perfect, which is why they gave us Article 5 to amend the Constitution, which it was amended several times. But anyway, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote for the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordained and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, the general welfare, I think I have an episode on that. The general welfare clause was meant for the general welfare of our nation, not for individuals, not for companies, not for organizations like Planned Parenthood, not for universities. So that general welfare clause has been totally misconstrued by the Supreme Court. It's a subject for another day. But the original intent of the general welfare clause was we can write laws and spend money on those items that are going to benefit the general welfare of the United States. Okay, so that's the preamble of the Constitution. So let's talk about rights. Remember, I said that the Constitution is there to protect you and me and protect our rights, and that the government can't infringe on these rights. Okay, so there's two types of rights spoken about in the Constitution. One is called inalienable rights. Sometimes you're going to hear that be called unalienable rights. The words have changed over the course of time. Inalienable rights and unalienable rights are basically they mean the same thing. Okay, these rights are natural rights granted by God, and they cannot be taken away. You have a right to life, freedom of speech, pursuit of happiness. Okay, these are all rights that are spelled out in the Constitution, amongst others. Okay, now enumerated rights are rights that are written. Okay, many of the rights in the Constitution reflect the grievances that we gave to King George III as outlined in the Declaration of Independence. And there are 27 grievances that we spoke of in the Declaration to King George. Okay. And one of those that came out later in some of the amendments, the right to bear arms, that's the Second Amendment. Your right to trial by jury. King George was not allowing us a jury trial. Okay. The right to representation. We were being taxed, the colonies were being taxed without any representation whatsoever. He made the Constitutional Congress defunct. Okay. So these are some of the enumerated rights that are in the Constitution. All right. Now, again, it's the government's right. It's the government's obligation to protect us from these inalienable and enumerated rights. Now, there's a third type of rights. It's called unenumerated rights. A lot of people think, geez, the right isn't found in the Constitution, so you don't have a right to do that. No, 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 no. The Constitution was not meant to categorize every single right known to man. These rights were very specific to the grievances found in the Declaration and also other natural rights as ordained by God. Okay. But for example, you have a right to privacy, you have a right to travel. That's not in the Constitution. You have a right to raise a family, you have a right to educate your family. Okay. A right to make a living. All right. These are unwritten rights that just because they're not in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have these rights, right? And those rights also are protected by the government. It's their job to protect all of these rights for us citizens. I don't say we do a really great job at that all the time. Okay. We'll talk more about the checks and balances in terms of why we are set up the way we're set up in order to try the best we can to protect the rights of us citizens. So the Constitution has three sections. Like the Declaration had four, they have three here. One is the preamble. That sets the stage for the Constitution and the 7 articles that are in the Constitution. There are 7 articles. Okay. This preamble communicates the intentions of the framers and the purpose of the document. Okay. There are 7 articles. There are 27 complaints, and the U.S. Constitution later drafted to ensure these were taken care of. These grievances were protected and taken care of in the framework. And then along with that, there were 27 amendments. As of today, there's 27 amendments, some of which have been repealed, like the amendment on prohibition that got repealed. Okay. But the first 10 amendments were known as the Bill of Rights. And these 10 amendments were necessary to get all of the states, especially the state of New York, to sign on to the Constitution, because the state of New York in particular had a real problem with overreaching federal governments. Kind of funny today to think about the state of New York, which went in the total opposite direction in terms of government control. But back then, they were really concerned. So Madison and John Jay and Hamilton wrote what's called the Federalist Papers. These were articles written into the newspapers in New York, explaining the Constitution, explaining the framework of what this government was going to be like. So a lot of times those Federalist Papers are referred to as legal documents to go back and understand what a particular clause or passage in the Constitution really meant. So these Federalist Papers are a real key to getting New York to sign on. If New York didn't sign on with the other 12 colonies, we would not have a country today. Okay. So let's talk about the articles. I'm just going to go through these pretty quick. Now, I go into detail on all these articles in previous episodes of the Constitution. Okay. Article 1, the first three articles talk about the three branches of government. Okay, so Article 1 talks about the legislative branch, and that is the Congress and the Senate. It talks about all the rules there. For example, Article 1, Section 8 talks about the 18 reasons why Congress can write laws, which have now been pretty much abridged because of the interpretation of the General Welfare Clause, but that's a subject for another day. Half the words in the Constitution, remember the original Constitution was 4,543 words, half the Constitution is dedicated to Article 1, the legislative branch. Okay. Article 2, the executive branch. That's the president and what the Article 2 responsibilities are of the president. It's interesting that President Trump is trying to exercise his Article 2 powers by reducing the size of government in these agencies, which report into the executive branch. Many of these agencies are unconstitutional, by the way. And these agencies have taken on a life of their own in terms of their powers and their unabridged, unchecked ability to write regulations which have the power of law. I have a whole episode on that. Okay. Now President Trump is trying to exercise his Article 2 powers, which are totally legitimate. And people say, "Whoa, hold on. You know, you diving into our piggy bank, and along the way, they're finding all this fraud, all this corruption." Okay, these branches were allowed to take a life onto their own, and the pushback that we're getting from the people who are profiting from government is incredible. Okay, maybe I'll do an episode on that someday. It's amazing how you go into Congress at $170,000, $180,000 a year, and a few years later you walk out multi-millionaires. Okay, it just doesn't happen. When I ran for Congress, I was not allowed to run my business. I couldn't take a dime from other employment. I had to go and get residence in Washington had I won. Okay, it is a losing financial proposition if you're honest. Okay, but so many people in Washington are there to make money, and I'm not only talking about politicians. I'm talking about the bureaucrats that run these agencies that you don't even know. You don't even know their name. Okay. So the executive branch is how the president is going to execute his responsibilities to basically run the government. I mean, the executive branch is all about enforcing laws, okay, and running the administrative side of the government. And then the third branch is the judicial branch, which I think is the shortest of the three in terms of word count. But that talks about the Supreme Court and the duties of the Supreme Court to judge whether or not articles or laws, I should say, or executive orders are constitutional. Okay. Now, Article 4 talks about the relationship between the states. Article 5 is the amendment process. So if we want to amend the Constitution, we have to go through a convention of states in Article 5. Okay. I won't go through the gory details of that, but that's the provision that the founders gave us to amend the Constitution. And again, it's above and beyond the 10 amendments. There were 17 other amendments issued since our founding in the Constitution. Not all good ones, by the way. And I do talk about the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment. Some of these amendments were not good, and actually fly in the face of the spirit of what our Constitution was originally all about. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause and also the oaths of office for all the different, president and what have you, Congress. The Supremacy Clause basically says, hey, Constitution is the law of the land. States cannot override any federal law pursuant thereof, pursuant to the fact that it's constitutional. Okay? So this is a really good case in point. There's a law in the books, a federal law in the books right now that outlaws marijuana. Well, you might ask, how come my state allows marijuana? Because it's an unconstitutional law. That law is not in the spirit of what's allowed to be on the books of the federal government. That's left to the states or to the people. That's the 10th Amendment. I'll talk about it in a minute. So you say to yourself, well, geez, they wrote a law, so it's got to be the law of the land. No, it's not, because the states know, and so does the government, that the government would lose if the states ever brought suit against them as it relates to marijuana laws. Okay? That's just one example. Right? There's many of those. I'm giving you one. And then the last amendment, 7, is all about how we ratified our Constitution and all that, and the whole ratification process in terms of how that went through. Then, of course, there's 27 amendments. So the Constitution started out with 4,543 words. That's it. Very, well written. But written at the time, so you have to really understand the lexicon used back then. And this is why Webster's 1828 dictionary is so key. He wrote that dictionary knowing that the words in the Constitution were going to be challenged, they're going to be changed, and that we needed to memorialize the meaning of those words. So if you're really interested in studying the Constitution, I refer to the 1828 Webster's dictionary all the time to understand what they meant by certain phrases or words that are in our founding documents. And by the way, I'm not talking about the Merriam-Webster dictionary. That's a BS dictionary. It has all kinds of woke crap in it. Words have been changed, meanings have been changed. I'm talking about the original 1828 Webster dictionary. He's the only author. There's no Merriam, and there's no whoever else might be out there. Okay, you can get it on Amazon. I got a nice hardcover copy. I asked my wife for this for Christmas, and so people said, "Hey, what did Diane get you for Christmas?" I said, "Well, she got me a dictionary," and it's like, "What, Mark? What? She got you what?" Yeah, I wanted this dictionary, And they look at me like I'm some kind of nerd, which maybe I am. But and by the way, you can get it in hardcover, a little more expensive, or you can get it in softcover. When you get this dictionary, you will not believe how many words are in it, how thick it is, how small the print is. And Webster did this without the internet. I mean, it's incredible what this guy put together. Okay. Matter of fact, I had a chance to visit his house. I used to live in West Hartford, Connecticut, and that's where he lived. And his home is still there on South Main Street in West Hartford, Connecticut. And you can see the original works on display inside his little red cape right on South Main Street, right by the golf course over there. Kind of neat. If you're ever in the area, go check it out. Okay, but the amendments, the Constitution went from 4,500 words to like 7,600 words, rough numbers, which um, almost doubled in size with the amendments. Okay, let's talk about one of the more brilliant parts of the Constitution. Judge Scalia, God rest his soul, who was a real originalist of the Constitution, talked about this as being perhaps the most unbelievable, important part of the Constitution, along with other things like the Electoral College, like the Second Amendment, right for free speech, trial by jury, all the protections that we have. This one here, the checks and balances, well, we have checks and balances between the three branches of government, between the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. So, one of the checks and balances, for example, is that Congress has the right to impeach either a judge or a president. Okay. Another check and balances is the veto power that the president has over legislation. But then again, there's another check and balance that says 2/3 vote within both chambers, the Congress and the Senate, can override a veto. And then you got the judicial branch, which can deem a law or a regulation or executive order unconstitutional. Okay, these are some of the checks. There's others too, by the way, but these are some of the major checks and balances that we have within our government. Okay, so when President Biden said that he's going to take money and spend it on tuition reimbursement, the Supreme Court said no, that's unconstitutional. He went and did it anyway, by the way, and nobody held him accountable. But it's unconstitutional for two reasons. One, the whole framework of spending money on somebody's tuition is outside the spirit of our Constitution. It's not pursuant thereof. And secondly, the president can't spend money. The power of the purse is vested in Congress, not with the president. Okay, so so this is how it's supposed to work. It's not efficient. Government wasn't supposed to be efficient. The founders wanted the ability to pass a law to be very tough to do. People say, well, the government's not working. We can't get anything done. They have a misunderstanding of the framework of what the founders wanted. They wanted it to be tough. They wanted debate. They wanted people to struggle to write laws. Right now, I don't understand how we write so many laws. We write thousands of laws. I don't even know, and I'm sure many of them are in conflict with each other. But when you look at all these different laws that are out there, I'm sure right now I'm breaking a law. I don't know. You probably are too. We don't even know what law we're breaking right now. Okay. There's so many out there. Anyway, um, so these checks and balances are so unique. And when you look at other countries that have parliaments, like India, for example, or England, the executive branch, which would be the prime minister, is beholden to the parliament, which is analogous to the legislative branch. And they can have a no confidence vote and vote the prime minister out. There's no checks and balances there. That's one of the reasons these governments are in such shambles. Okay, not to say that ours is in any great shape, but I think pound for pound we're in better shape than they are. All right, but you can vote out a prime minister if you get Can you imagine if we had that? If Congress, the Democratic Congress, had that ability with Trump, he would be out in a day. Okay, overriding the voice of the people who put him in there. So, anyway, these checks and balances are a real key part of our framework. And now let's talk about the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments written by James Madison of the Constitution, okay, it won over these skeptical states, especially New York. It guaranteed basic rights, inalienable and enumerated, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. By the way, on the religion part of this thing and this whole notion of separation of church and state, which is a big misnomer and not in the Constitution. I have an episode earlier on. I can't remember which episode, maybe 42 or somewhere back there, that talks about this whole separation of church and state and what a scam it was with a racist KKK Supreme Court judge named Hugo Black, okay, put in place by FDR, and how he misconstrued a letter that Jefferson wrote to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, who were concerned about their rights and their ability to have freedom of religion. Okay. I have a whole episode on that. Go check that one out. It's kind of a neat story. But freedom of speech, freedom of the press, right to privacy, right to bear arms, which is an enumerated right. Okay. And that right to bear arms goes back to the inalienable right of your right to defend yourself. That right comes from God. And they put the right to bear arms as a enumerated right to marry up with that inalienable right, which was your right to defend yourself. Okay. Now, these amendments, remember what I said, the Constitution was a document limiting the government to infringe on our rights. And their number one responsibility, besides protecting us from invasions, foreign and domestic, or enemies, foreign and domestic, is to protect our rights as citizens. 7 of these amendments state that the government shall not infringe, shall not. 2 of the 10 amendments state what the government shall do. Okay. Well, okay. 7 and 2 is 9. What about the 10th one? Well, let's talk about the 10th Amendment. Why do you need to know the 10th Amendment? Probably a huge, important, um, a very important amendment. It basically says, pretty clear, if it's not in the Constitution, then the federal government can't do it. It's left to the states or to the people. Okay? It makes it clear that any powers not specifically given to the federal government by the people are reserved to the states or the people. Okay? You need to know this because once you know the Constitution, you can judge whether or not a law or a regulation or even an agency is constitutional. But you must understand the Constitution in order to make that call. Okay? So let me read the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, in other words, by the people, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, people say, well, what does that mean to the people? Because if the states aren't doing their job, the people can take over. That's what that means. Now, I got the question on the Second Amendment where they said, well, the question came out, why do we have these state laws that basically override the Second Amendment in some cases? Okay, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It's the Second Amendment. Very clear. Okay. So how come I can't carry a handgun in New York City or LA? Almost impossible to get a carry permit in Massachusetts. In some cases, you have to prove that you were already attacked if you want to defend yourself. Well, the issue goes down to the citizens. I don't look at the government. I look at the citizens of the individual states that allow their state representatives to pass these laws that are not in concert with the Second Amendment. It's the citizens' fault for allowing their own state representatives to write these state laws that limit their rights to the Constitution. It's as simple as that. It's the state representatives and the people who vote for them who don't push back. All right? We'll leave that there, but I think it's something I want you to think about because we do it to ourselves. And remember, the Supreme Court can't see there's thousands of cases every year that get presented to the Supreme Court, and they only pick a handful. There's only 9 jurors there. They can't do everything. Not every law can go through. So you know darn well there are a boatload of laws that get passed that are on the books today that are unconstitutional because they haven't gone through judicial review. This, these Supreme Court justices have a vote in terms of what laws they're going to, what cases they're going to hear, and obviously they're going to pick the most important ones, relative to to our nation. They can't pick everything, so I can guarantee you there are hundreds, if not thousands, of laws on the books right now that are unconstitutional. And that was a miss, maybe, by how we. I don't think the founders ever thought there would be so many laws passed. They made it really tough to pass a law, but for some reason, we've got these huge laws that have 5,000 different provisions in it. Okay, you can have a law on veterans, and also, along with that law, somebody's passing a pork belly bill on Planned Parenthood. Okay, so what do you do? So the line item veto was ruled unconstitutional back when Ronald Reagan wanted the Supreme Court to look at that. And by the way, I agree with that. But the president can also sit there and say, look, I'm not passing any law unless it's a single topic bill. Okay. Now, they can still override the veto, right? But I'm going to veto every law that has more than one, subject to it. That could be something the president tries anyway. I don't know how well that would work. But you get these bills that are passed, and they're all over the map. And then when it comes election time, it's like, how come you voted for that? Well, if I didn't vote for that, I wouldn't have gotten this. And I think the Supreme Court looked at, they wanted compromise, right? I mean, the federal, the founding fathers wanted compromise amongst our legislators, and to work things out in this fashion. Personally, I think it's gotten out of control. But anyway, um, and as our friend Thomas Jefferson said, who I think is one of the most brilliant guys in our history, most bad government results from too much government. And if that isn't true today as it ever was, then I don't know what else to tell you. Okay. The 10th Amendment is a very important amendment that you need to learn. And then this whole business about slavery. Why were they counted as 3/5 of a person? I've heard college students say, oh, yeah, the founders thought that slaves were only worth 3/5 of a human being. And that's how they're taught. They're taught this way by college professors and high school teachers. No, the reason they did that, the founders knew slavery was wrong. I talked more about this in the previous episode. Okay, on episode 43 on the Declaration. Matter of fact, Franklin was an abolitionist. Thomas Jefferson, when he was a young legislator, 27 years old, in the Continental Congress, it authored a bill to allow the freedom of slaves. A lot of people, they don't teach you that in school, do they? Okay, and it got knocked down by its elders, like right away. But again, they also knew that if they tried to fight the slavery issue, then they would never have put this country together, and that was something that was really wise, believe it or not. And what were these founders to do? Let their slaves go to be captured by some sadistic tyrant that would beat them to a pulp for escaping, and then endure whatever they would have to endure as a slave? They couldn't just let these guys free. There were bounties on people, on slaves. Okay. So, we're misinformed in a lot of cases in terms of what this was. But this 3/5 thing, you got to remember, the South were abolitionists, and they I mean, they were pro-slavery, I should say, and they knew if a slave was counted as a full person. You got to remember how our congressmen are developed. Right now, today, there are 435 congressmen in our country, and that's legislated. That number could change, but right now it's 435. We take a census every 10 years. We divide that census, whatever it was, 330 million, divided by 435, and that gives you the number of people that has to be in every congressional district around the country. So that means, I think the number came out to somewhere around the 760,000 mark, okay, and change. I forget the exact number. But But now every congressional district has to have 760,000 people in it. Okay. And they do it to the person, too, by the way. Okay. So when they figure out these new districts every 10 years and redistrict every state, it's to the person. And it's interesting because some states might lose because their population went down, like New York. Some might gain. Um, like some of the southern states picked up some seats in Congress because they had more people. Well, anyway, the founders knew that if slaves were counted as a full person, there'd be more congressional districts in the South which were pro slavery, meaning more congressmen that were pro slavery, meaning that they could write laws that would legalize and permanently legalize slavery. So the whole idea with the 3/5 rule wasn't because the founders thought a black slave was worth 3/5 of a white person. Absolutely not. But that's how it's being taught. It was because they wanted to not memorialize slavery into our laws. Okay. And the way this is being taught today is a travesty. It really is. By high school teachers and by college professors alike. And they know better. These people know better. Okay. Or maybe they don't. Maybe I'm giving them too much of a benefit of the doubt. Anyway, so I wanted to address that 3/5 thing because I think that's kind of important to get out there. So I think it's important to both understand the Declaration and the Constitution. I believe that as you read it, every time I read it, I learn something new. Oh, geez, I didn't really get that. Or, geez, I didn't understand that clause. I have to look it up. It takes a lot of work to be a conservative. It takes a lot of work to understand our founding. It's not easy. Language has changed. You know, the lexicon that was used is different than today. You can't take a lot of things literally the way it was written, believe it or not, which is why we have the founding documents like the uh, uh, the papers written by Madison and Hamilton and John Jay, the Federalist Papers. Okay, there's also the Anti-Federalist Papers too, by the way, which gives the other side of the equation. Not as many, but there were people like Hamilton. Believe it or not, I was really surprised Hamilton was one of the guys that was writing on the Federalist side because he was a big government guy. And again, these papers were to explain the Constitution and to assure that the federal government would be a limited government. Okay. But I'll leave you with this, as I did in the last episode. Thomas Jefferson, who I think was the most brilliant of all of our founders, maybe him and Franklin are tied, I don't know. A well informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. I'm sorry, we are not informed today. This is why I'm doing this podcast. We are not informed as a people. We don't have a good feel or framework for what this country is all about and how special and different we are. The whole movement towards socialism that's being taught in schools. I mean, go down the list of what truly is going on here today. Okay. And it's not good. It's not good. It's not good what we're seeing today. And we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to educating our students. The only problem is the teachers that are educating them were miseducated as well. So I'm not really sure what you do with that, but we've got to get back on track and get this country back into the spirit of what these founders risked their lives for, and the work and the blood, sweat, and tears of all of our military who fought to keep our freedoms. So I'll leave you with that. Episode 44, the U.S. Constitution. And look forward to episode 45. Thanks. God bless. Thanks for listening to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God. The Constitution is the solution to most of our country's problems. Other episodes can be found on our website at 1787solution.com, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most other podcast platforms. I'm your host, Mark DeLuzio. Until next time, may God bless you, may God bless America, and may America bless God.